testimony, but we all have again that we can share the time before we was in Christ, what happened when the gospel was shared with us, and then the transformation that gospel has made, that the believing in Jesus Christ, our faith. And so we're going to see Paul is going to say, or it's going to be his defense through his testimony. And he's going to begin with his zeal for Judaism. So verses 1 through 3, chapter 22, and Luke writes, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he saith, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day." So I want to mention first here that he's going to begin speaking to them in the Hebrew tongue. He's going to speak to them in the Hebrew language. And what Paul is trying to do is immediately when he begins to speak, he's trying to build common ground. He's trying to get on a personal level with them and to show them that, hey, I'm one of you, that I'm also an Israelite. I was raised up an Israelite. And he's going to do this, and he's going to begin his speech with the same way, if you went back to chapter 7, the same way Stephen. Remember, he was martyred, even with Paul present. He's going to begin the speech the same way. Men, brethren, and fathers. So he's going to say men, as in those that are standing before him, but then he's going to try and really connect with them. He's going to say brethren, right? He's going to say, he's trying to connect on the level of I am one of you. We are brethren. I was raised up the same way. We was taught the same things. They may have been in classes together. They studied the same things. They practiced the same things. They believed the same things. And Paul's saying, I'm a brethren to you. He's saying I'm not like, he may have been literally a stranger, but he's saying I'm not a stranger in the sense of how we was raised, how we was taught. And he's saying that he's brethren to them, and he calls them fathers. So he's also making that connection even with the older ones of those that are as a father figure, not so much a literal father, but in the sense that he was taught of them, that everything they know, they had passed down to Paul. Paul's not saying, he's trying to build that connection here of not saying it's not like I'm somebody who was taught and left. He's saying, but you are the fathers of what I've even been taught, of the law, of the teachings, of the practices. Paul is trying to build common ground. He's going to speak to them in the Hebrew language. He's going to reference them as brethren and as fathers to try and build almost like this family type connection. He wants them to understand that he comes where they're from. He's part of them. And so he says, men, brethren, and fathers, hear my defense, which I make unto you now. And he says, I am truly, he's saying, I truly am a man which am a Jew. I am a Jew. Paul never in his life ever really left that status. Now he's a Christian, but Paul is saying, I'm a Jew. I was raised a Jew. I was taught as a Jew. I practiced as a Jew. I still hold to the traditions and the rituals of the Jews. He knows that's not what brings justification. He knows these things aren't what saves. But he's saying, I truly am a Jew. I was born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, up in Asia Minor. He says, but yet I was brought up in this city. He goes, I might have been born in Tarsus, but I was brought up. I was raised and trained in Jerusalem as a Jew. And a matter of fact, he says, brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. And that is probably the most honored and respected rabbi, at least of that time, in all of Jewish culture. And all of the schools and the teachings and all of the teachers and rabbis that there were, many writings say that Gamaliel was the most respected. He would have been, so to speak, the greatest teacher. And Paul's saying, not only am I a Jew, and not only am I of the same teachings of you, but I literally studied under the greatest teacher of the law. And I practiced those things. He goes and taught. Not only was he brought up, but he taught according to the perfect. Notice here, he's almost trying to butter him up. Right? I taught according to the perfect manner of the law. I taught the law. I taught all the law. He goes, there wasn't a part of it I let out. I studied it. I loved it. I lived it. And I taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. I mean, notice what Paul's saying here in building this common ground. I mean, he's getting to the point where he's trying to show them that how he truly views the law, that he has still has an honor for it. right? Remember, Paul never once teaches that the law brings any kind of justification, doesn't bring any kind of righteousness, it doesn't bring any kind of favor with God. But he's trying to build the defense that he never once, so to speak, dishonored or disrespected the law. He never done that. He says, I was zealous towards God as ye all are this day. He's saying the same way that you guys are so zealous and passionate for the law and for God, so was I, and so am I zealous for God. And so Paul is building this common ground. He's sharing his zeal for Judaism. He's trying to explain to him that even though this rumor started that he didn't want anything to do with the law and that they should dismiss it, Paul's trying to build here that I never said that. This is how I view the law, and I honor it. So he's going to build that zeal for Judaism. He's going to explain to him he does not think it should be dismissed. And then he's going to move into more of his personal testimony, his experience with Christ here in verses 4 through 9. So he's going to share how he was, and then he's going to move into what had happened. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest doth bear me witness in all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come near unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell into the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. Now, one thing I do want to mention here before we go through these verses is that Paul's going to share his testimony, and there's many that would take this context and say, well, this is the method of evangelism. Well, that's not necessarily the case here. This is a good example on how to share our testimonies, but Paul specifically here is not trying to evangelize, but he's giving his defense. Now, certainly Paul is, I'm kind of assuming here, I would assume Paul is obviously in sharing his testimony is hoping for conversion, right? He's probably looking for a chance to calm down the riotness, calm down all those that are angry, tell him his defense, and to share with them the gospel. But Paul never really here shares the gospel. He just gives his testimony. And one thing we've got to understand is that sharing our testimony is not directly going to bring about salvation. That's through the sharing of the gospel. Now, bringing that testimony certainly builds common ground, right? It builds a personal relationship. It gets doors opened up. So I'm not saying not to share our testimony. Absolutely we should share our testimony with people. But we've got to lead that into the gospel of Christ and explain to how this is how I once was. After I had repented, believed in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, this is how I now am. So share the testimony, but it's not the testimony that saves. One preacher one time said, I think it might have been Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, I think he said this. He said, whatever saves them is what will keep them. And so it's important to understand that if people are saved by testimonies, well, now they're relying on a testimony to keep them and not the power of the Holy Spirit through the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's always got to be the gospel that brings about the transformation, brings about the salvation. And so Paul begins by telling them, he tells them how he was zealous for the law, zealous for their fathers and God. And he begins to share how he persecuted this way, talking about the Christians. He persecuted Christians unto death. So we see here that Paul was so severe of a persecutor of the Christians of the way that at times it was to death, that he would have literally murdered Christians. And of course we know he was there on the day that Stephen was martyred back in the 7th chapter, binding and delivering into prison men and women. So Paul was, whether it was him directly or him sending out the orders, he was either himself or sending others into houses to take those that were Christian, to bind them and to bring them into prison. Not just men, but women. So I mean, think about that for a moment, the lack of respect that he had for Christians. Paul didn't care if he was a man, he didn't care if he was women, he didn't care if he was old or young. If you were a Christian, then you were dangerous to God. And you say, well, that sounds kind of crazy because Christians serve God. Well, that's what happens when you don't know who God is. And they formed their own God in their mind. And so Paul, thinking he was doing a good thing for God, was actually binding and delivering into prisons. And he also mentions here that also the high priest does bear witness. And all the estate of the elders, that's the council or the Sanhedrin that we're going to talk about later on in this chapter and in the next chapter. But he says they also can bear witness of this, of what I had done, all the persecution. They would tell you of this. If you were to go and talk to the Sanhedrin, if you were to go to talk to the high priest, they would tell you all the persecution that Paul had done towards the Christians. And he says, from them also I received letters to the brethren. He says, it's from them I actually got the letters or the acceptance to go to Damascus and to bring them bound to Jerusalem. Paul's saying it's from them I actually got letters, I got the approval to literally leave Jerusalem and to go up and towards Damascus and to find all those that were Christians along the way and to actually bind them. I mean, Paul's here is explaining how serious he was about imprisoning and persecuting Christians. He wanted to bring them bound to Jerusalem to be punished. And Paul begins to explain this is what was going on. I was heading up that way. And it came to pass that as I made my journey, was come near to Damascus about noon. Suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. So he's walking up the road. He's traveling. And a light comes from above. And we're going to see that the light was so bright that it's going to blind him. And he says, during this happened, I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Now many would say that this is when Paul, or rather Saul at that moment in time, was converted, because he says and answered, who art thou, Lord? But it's rather just a title of respect or honor, right? I mean, if you saw a great light and you're walking up and a light comes on you so bright that you can't even see, as a matter of fact, it takes away your sight, it damages your eyes, you're not going to, whatever this being is, right, you're going to want some sort of favor with it, okay? Because he doesn't know who Jesus Christ is here in the sense of as Lord. So he said, he does answer, who art thou, Lord? But he's saying, who are you? Well, he can't be born again if he doesn't know who Jesus Christ is. And he says, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. Yeah. 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 Whoever it was, Paul was going to make him his master. Yeah. I mean, if all we known, it could have been Buddha. Paul didn't know who it was. And he answers, he says, who art thou, Lord? The voice says to him, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. Now notice Jesus says to Paul here twice, there's this great light, Paul's on the ground, he can't see, all those that are with him see the light, but they don't hear the voice of him that spake to me. So all those that are with him just see this great light. And so I kind of imagine here that all those that were with him, they probably somehow shielded their eyes. They probably somehow looked away. But Paul must have been fixated on this light because he's going to lose his sight because of it. And he's going to hear a voice, and Jesus is going to say to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Now think about this for a moment, because Paul has never met Jesus Christ. He's never seen the guy. He's never talked to him, never met him. He might have been involved maybe back in the day in some of the murder of Christ. He maybe would have been involved with that. But he never knew Christ. Yet Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? anytime Christians are persecuted, it's also the persecution of Christ. Those aren't my words. That's what we see from Christ here. And when you go back to the 25th chapter of Matthew, you remember at the end what Jesus had said. He was talking about that final day of judgment when there would be a separation of the sheep and the goats. And I think it was the goats would be on the left and the sheep would be on the right. Remember what Jesus said, talking to both the sheep and the goats. But for this reference, he talked to the goats and he said, because you did not feed me when I was hungry, and you did not give me drink when I was thirsty, and when I was a stranger, you did not welcome me in, and when I was naked, you did not clothe me, and when I was sick and in prison, you did not visit me. And Jesus said they're going to look at him and say, when did we not do these things for you? When did we not feed you? And when did we not clothe you? And when did we not visit you when you were sick? And Jesus is going to say, if you did it not to the least of these, those that are naked, those that are hungry, those that are sick and in prison, if you didn't do those things to them, for them, then you didn't do them for me. So we see a very high calling there, and what Christ said is, and to not so much to take care of people, but we certainly should be compassionate. If we see somebody hungry, we ought to feed them. If we see somebody naked, we ought to clothe them. Because in doing those things, we're also, specifically Christians, but in doing those things, we're essentially either persecuting Christ or caring for Christ. It's what Jesus said. And Paul, with persecuting the Christians, thinking he was doing something for good for God, Paul was actually persecuting Jesus Christ. But went too far. Does anybody have anything before we move on to these next verses?
Some people point out the contradiction in chapter 9 and chapter 22. Because chapter 22 says they heard the voice. And this thing says they heard not the voice of him. So there's a spiritual connotation there. They heard something. But he said they didn't hear the voice I heard.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Very good point.
They did not hear what I heard.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's because of that. That's why Paul's eyes went blind. But also, it is so right. They probably couldn't even see Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point too. I mean, I know yesterday we was fishing around that time, and it was hard to see then. I couldn't imagine just a light brighter than the sun just took away. It's really kind of surprising it took away his vision. Well, of course we know the Lord gave his vision back, but I was going to say took his vision away even just for the short period of time, but it probably would have been for his life had the Lord not said, Paul, I have a mission for you, and given it back to him. But we see Paul's mission from Christ. So Paul explains how he was on his way to persecute Christians. This is what happened where this bright light comes down. Jesus Christ speaks to him. And now he's going to explain what happens after this. And so verses 10 through 21. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told of thee all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man, according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there, came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. In the same hour I looked upon him, and he said, the God of our fathers has chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will, and see that just one, and shouldest hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I was also standing by, and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. So Paul tells them that during this experience on the road of Damascus, he meets Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul's going to say to him, "What shall I do, Lord?" And the Lord said unto me, "Arise and go into Damascus." So Jesus is going to tell him what to do here. "Go into Damascus. There it shall be told of thee all things which are appointed for thee to do." So he's going to tell Paul to go into Damascus, and he's going to say, you're going to find someone there, and it's going to be appointed for thee to do. He really doesn't tell him that that he's going to find somebody. He just says, get there, and it's going to be appointed for you. And Paul says, "For when I could not see by the glory of the light, I was led by the hand of them that were with me." I mean, this man, he wasn't just seeing those purple little circles that you get when you stare at the sun for 3 or 4 seconds. He wasn't halfway blind. This man could not see. He was being led by those that were with him. His vision was gone. And so they come into Damascus. One man by the name of Ananias, he's a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there. Now, Paul's not just saying that for no reason. Remember, he's building his defense here to the Jews in Jerusalem. So he uses the high priest, the Sanhedrin, to defend his where he was, that he respects the law. And then he's going to say, even I meet Ananias, who is a devout Jew. He has a good report with the Jews. He's saying, so this man can also testify to what happened. And I meet Ananias there, and he comes into me, and he stood, and he says to me, "Brother Saul, receive thy sight." And he says, that same hour I looked upon him. So Ananias, we obviously, if we went back, we know Ananias' side of the story. And Ananias is going to go to Saul, and he's going to say, "Receive your sight," and Paul's going to receive his sight. And then Ananias is going to tell him what's appointed of him to do. He said, "The God of our fathers has chosen thee, that thou shouldest know his will." Now, when he says know his will, he's not talking about just Paul's personal will for his life, but he's talking about God's will for his church. He's telling Paul here that, Paul, you're going to know the will of God to establish the church, to begin building this kingdom on earth, which will be the church. And see that just one, to see Jesus Christ, to hear his voice of his mouth. All these things were appointed of God for Paul. And of course, we've seen these things happen. He says, "For thou shalt be as his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard." He basically tells Paul here in a shortness of the story of your mission is going to be to really begin to found and to build upon the church, not only for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. Now, Paul hasn't said that yet, but he's about to. And then the Jews are going to become angry because they don't like that word, Gentile. But he tells Paul that this is going to be your mission, is to build this church, to have personal revelation from Jesus Christ. And so then he's going to say, "Now why thou tarriest?" He goes, basically he says, you're here now, let's get this thing started, let's get going. There's no more time to delay or to wait. "Arise, be baptized." Even Paul, you say, did the Apostle Paul have to be baptized? Absolutely. I shouldn't say he has to be baptized, but we should be baptized as that symbol of salvation. And so Paul is going to be baptized. Again, I think we've covered enough of baptism and washing away thy sins. Baptism doesn't wash away the sins. It's an answer to a good conscience and calling on the name of the Lord. And then Paul's going to say, "It came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem." So this is going to be 2 to 3 years later after the road to Damascus. He's sharing another story. He said, "While I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance." So he's building a defense here. He's saying, look, I even still go to the temple to pray. I mean, Paul is completely saying these rumors that you've heard are completely not true, anything about me or what I've said or how I live. And so he begins to tell them, "And saw him," talking about Jesus, "saying to me, Make haste, get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me." So he tells them that Jesus told Paul to get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they're not going to listen to what he has to say. And Paul's going to tell them that he had said to the Lord, I don't know why when I was reading this, I just found it kind of comical, just imagining Paul kind of going back and forth, between the Lord of Jesus saying, "Do this," and Paul saying, "Well, what about this? I have an idea." But, we do that all the time. Maybe I do. Maybe I'm just the only one that sometimes argues with the Lord. But Paul's in a trance here, so it's a little bit different. But Jesus tells them to get out of Jerusalem. They're not going to receive his testimony concerning Christ. Paul's going to say, "Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat everyone in the synagogue that believed on thee. He's going to say, even when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I was standing by. I consented unto his death. I actually held the clothes of those that slew him. And Christ is again going to tell him, and he said to me, depart, for I will send thee far hence, it means from here, unto the Gentiles. So Christ is saying, not only about your safety, but I have a mission for you to do. Remember, this was years back from what's actually going on here. But Paul's sharing that story, how God told him, Christ told him to go and to minister to the Gentiles. So Paul's saying here, it's not like this is something that I just wanted to do. This was a mission commanded to me by God. Paul's saying, if you got a problem with the Gentiles, take it up with God. It's God who said to go to the Gentiles. It wasn't my idea. And certainly I'm not saying Paul was against it, but this was God's mission for Paul's life. In the application, it says, one of the most inspiring examples of courage in the history of the church was the martyrdom of Polycarp. I hope I said that right. Who was burned at the stake for his faith. The aged Polycarp had been arrested by the Roman authorities and brought to the arena for execution in front of the cheering crowd. The proconsul pressed him hard and said, swear and I will release you. Revile Christ. Polycarp replied, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me wrong. How can I now blaspheme my king that has saved me? During the Watergate scandal, some people regarded it as a compliment to be on Nixon's enemy list. They took it as a credit to them that people in the administration opposed them. In the same way, if you have enemies because of your righteousness, it will be a credit to you. You should be glad you have those kinds of enemies and that they are persecuting you, because it means you are doing what unrighteous men hate and despise. And then quickly, we'll go through these verses. Again, there's not a whole lot here. It's what Paul gives his defense, and we're going to see what happens after this. So we're going to see the response to his testimony. And the crowd is going to riot. Verses 22 and 23. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Right. Right. Yep. And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices, and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, and the sentence isn't finished there, but we'll stop there. And so the immediate response to Paul's testimony here is, it says, and they gave him audience unto, that means attention until this word. In other words, they totally were quiet, listening to what Paul had to say, until he makes the remark that God had told him to go to the Gentiles. And as soon as Paul mentions the word Gentiles, the whole thing comes unleashed. They gave attention until this word, and then lifted up their voices. So as soon as he says God told him to go to the Gentiles, I can't imagine that Paul was done speaking here. Maybe he was. But I feel like as soon as he said Gentiles, the crowd of the Jews is going to raise up. They're going to begin to yell, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. In other words, he's going to say, basically, they're going to yell to take this man and to take his life. Kill him, get rid of him, take him off the earth. They don't want him here. They cried out, they cast off their clothes, their outer garments. They would have threw dust into the air. I mean, imagine this, just the riot that took place. Paul's standing, I think, here on a stair step, and all of a sudden he's speaking to thousands of Jews, or at least a very large number of Jews, And then they just begin to riot again. So that's the immediate response. The crowd is going to begin to riot. And then the Romans are actually going to spare him. Oh, you're all right. Yeah. No. Yep. 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 Not even realizing that's what they should have been, in a sense, doing a little bit different of a. But verse 24, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. And then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yeah. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was free born. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. On the morrow, because he would have not known the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So immediately this riot takes off. The Jews start kicking up dust and throwing their garments and yelling at Paul. And remember, the Romans don't like uproars. They don't like riots. They don't like all the noise, because if that gets back to the headquarters in Rome, the emperor might send an army down to calm it down. And it's not going to be, it's going to be violent. They want it calmed quickly. So the chief captain, the captain over the 1,000, commanded him to be brought into the castle. At this point, he's not going to be just questioned, but he's going to be examined by scourging. That's a little tool with leather bands on it that's got steel balls at the end of it for weight to really get momentum. And then also on the ends of it is piece of bones, along with sometimes some metal little stakes. And they would take these things and whip people in the back with them. And so Paul being bound, they're going to take him in. At this point, think about the Roman captain here for a moment, okay? There was a riot. Paul began to speak in Roman and telling him that, hey, I need to talk to these people. So then he's going to let him. And then Paul's going to begin to speak in the Hebrew tongue, of which the Roman captain has no idea what he's saying. So all the Roman captain sees is a great riot. Paul begins to speak in Hebrew. Everybody quiets down. Paul delivers this short speech, and then all of a sudden they start screaming again. He has no idea what was said. He doesn't know what's going on. And all he wants is peace and order. And he's going to obtain it by any means. So he's going to take Paul, and he's going to examine him by this scourging, that he might know why they are yelling and rioting against Paul. And as they bound him, Paul said unto the centurion, so Paul is now bound against probably a post, getting ready to be scourged, and Paul's going to say to the centurion, which is one of the captains over 100, he's not the main captain, he's one of the captains over 100, he's going to say, is it law for you to scourge a Roman, uncondemned? And when the centurion hears this, he's going to go and tell the chief captain, take care for what you do, for this is a Roman. In Rome, you could not beat or even bind, imprison a Rome without a fair trial, a Roman. Paul, being a Roman, knows this. So Paul's going to say this, and this guy's going to go to the chief captain and say, this guy's a Roman. If this guy gets to Rome, or if this news gets back to Rome, that we beat a Roman uncondemned, well, that meant probably death for that Roman captain and probably any centurion involved. So then the chief captain, he's going to come to him. He's going to say, are you a Roman? He's going to ask Paul, are you a Roman? Paul's going to say, yes. And the chief captain answered and says, with a great sum I obtained this freedom. Well, what's he saying there? Well, think about Paul. He just got back from traveling all around. He had just been beaten and yelled at by the Jews. The only way to get Roman citizenship was either to find favor with a Roman official, a great, great favor, and it would be pardoned to you, or you had to buy it, and it was not cheap. It cost a lot of money. Usually only wealthy people would buy citizenship. And so Paul probably didn't look very wealthy right now. Right? He was probably dirty. His clothes were probably matted. He did not look wealthy. And so when Paul makes this statement, hey, I'm a Roman, the chief captain's going to come to him and say, you know I bought this for a great amount of money, right? As in saying, you don't look like you bought a Roman citizenship. You don't look like you could afford it. Because I bought it and I know it costs a lot of money. Paul's going to say, but I was free-born. I was born a Roman citizen. Now when he's saying there, it doesn't mean he was born a Roman. You couldn't be born a Roman citizen. Somehow you had to purchase it. And it's very likely that either Paul's father or his grandfather, somehow they either found favor with a Roman official or they purchased it with a great amount of money. Now, we don't know either way. I tend to think it's likely that Paul probably came from a wealthy background. I mean, he was sent down to Jerusalem. He was trained under the best teacher. Paul was very educated. It's likely that Paul maybe came from a wealthy background and had purchased his Roman citizenship. Again, that's not factual. That's just kind of taking from what we see in Paul's life. But nonetheless, somebody in Paul's family purchased his citizenship at his birth, because Paul was a Roman citizen. So he tells this man this, and it wasn't common back then for people to lie about that, because we know how the Romans were. And so if a person's going to fake a Roman citizenship, they knew if somebody found out, it wasn't going to be a light consequence. So most people wouldn't just go around lying about this. So they're going to believe Paul. They believe Paul's a Roman citizen. This man's going to begin to freak out and say, okay, we got to get out of this situation. Nobody can find out that we even bound him. Nobody can find out that we even got him here to where we're going to scourge him. Because they would be in trouble, probably death just for that. Straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. Those that were going to scourge him, they left. Everybody doesn't want involved in that. They know the consequence. If it gets back to Rome, what had happened to a Roman citizen, what was going to happen. So they all depart. The chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman and bound him. And he's going to give Paul a fair trial here with the Sanhedrin on the next day, because he would have known the certainty. He wants to know what's going on, why he was accused of the Jews. He loosed Paul from his bounds, and he commanded the chief priests and all their council, the Sanhedrin, to appear, and Paul would be brought down to them, and they're going to sort this thing out. And so that's what we're going to see in that 23rd chapter next week, is Paul before the Sanhedrin. Paul was probably pretty lucky to be a Roman, because that scourging usually resulted in death. Application, it says, from now on until the end of the book of Acts, Paul will be in Roman custody. As far as this book is concerned, this was the end of his time as a free man, though not the end of his witness or his usefulness to God and God's people. And lastly, God has revealed a plan to Paul right at his conversion. Paul was a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. That was Acts chapter 9. Paul knew the general plan, but just like us, he didn't know how it would all work out. He had to trust God just like every believer. Sometimes we're told, or we have an idea of what God's will is, but we have no idea what that road there looks like. And we know Paul was expecting some sort of suffering, but I can't imagine that he knew what he was going to be getting into. But next week, chapter 23, we'll see him before the Sanhedrin, and we'll talk about the Sanhedrin and Pharisees and Sadducees and all those types of fun things.